How does someone get acquitted in a charity marketing scandal and still leave everyone feeling like they just got upsold on kindness with a premium price tag? Chiara Ferragni was cleared by a Milan judge on January 14, 2026, over fraud claims tied to the Ferragni-branded Pandoro campaign. Yet the internet's reaction wasn't "so the charity was real," it was "so the branding was legal." Because the record already had an earlier twist, Italy's competition authority said consumers were misled into thinking purchases funded a donation, while the €50,000 donation had already been made and Ferragni-linked companies collected over €1 million from the initiative. Then it all got waved off as a communication error. Stay till the end, because the court can clear a charge, but it can't clear the smell of a marketing machine selling virtue by the slice. Chiara Ferragni isn't a random influencer who lucked into a scandal. She's one of Europe's most recognizable digital-era celebrities, an entrepreneur, fashion icon, and brand machine whose fame was built on turning lifestyle into commerce. When someone like that attaches for charity to a product, it doesn't read like a casual holiday gesture. It reads like a full campaign. Credibility, emotion, and consumer trust packaged into a seasonal limited edition. And that's why Pandoro Gate landed so hard. Because the pitch wasn't just buy a cake. The vibe was buy a cake and be a good person while you're at it. The surface story begins with a Christmas product, a Ferragni-branded pink Pandoro cake collaboration with Italian company Balocco, promoted as tied to a children's hospital initiative. Then the cracks appeared. Italy's competition authority, AGCM, concluded that consumers were misled into believing purchases would help fund donations to a pediatric hospital, when in reality, the €50,000 donation to the hospital had already been made before the campaign, and the sales proceeds largely went to the companies involved. Reporting also described how Ferragni-linked companies received more than €1 million from the initiative. The moral dissonance was instant. The marketing suggested buyers were doing good, but the structure looked like buyers were paying extra for the feeling of doing good. And then came the influencer crisis response classic, a statement that tried to shrink the scandal into wording, a communication error, not a design choice, not an incentive problem, not a business model, just a little misunderstanding, like the public accidentally hallucinated the meaning of "for charity." Meanwhile, the commercial consequences hit harder than the legal ones at first. After the scandal, major brands reportedly paused or dropped partnerships, and Ferragni's image took a visible hit in a way that even her apology couldn't fully patch. Now, the plot twist that made this story explode again. On January 14, 2026, a Milan judge acquitted Ferragni of fraud allegations tied to the Pandoro campaign, with reporting noting the judge ruled there was no case to answer on the criminal charge. And that's where the surface image becomes irresistible. Acquitted reads like absolution to some people and like a loophole to everyone else, because a legal verdict can be clean while the optics stay dirty. The documentary version of reality says cleared. The internet version says still gross. The Ferragni myth was built on a very modern kind of credibility, not expertise, not artistry, but lifestyle authority. She didn't just sell outfits, she sold a version of life that looked effortless, aspirational, and emotionally warm. Over time, that authority expanded into business identity. She wasn't merely a person with followers, she was a brand whose name could raise the perceived value of whatever it touched. And once an influencer becomes that kind of symbol, for charity stops being a side note. It becomes a halo, a multiplier, a way to make a product feel morally upgraded. That's why the Pandoro campaign was the perfect myth vehicle. Holiday season, limited edition, a children's hospital cause, and the soft moral seduction of consumer culture. If you buy this, you're not just buying dessert, you're participating in goodness. It's the most elegant trick capitalism has ever pulled, turning ethics into a flavor you can add to a product, like strawberry or hazelnut, except this one is called kindness. And the best part is, it doesn't just sell cake, it sells identity. It sells the buyer the feeling that they're the kind of person who helps without having to do anything harder than shopping. Then the myth got reinforced through the language of sincerity. Influencer charity campaigns rarely scream profit. They whisper community, impact, together, for the kids. The emotional framing does the heavy lifting while the commercial structure stays politely off camera. That's what makes the later controversy so corrosive. Italy's competition authority concluded consumers were misled into thinking purchases funded a donation when the €50,000 donation had already been made, and reporting said Ferragni-linked companies received over €1 million from the initiative. The halo didn't just slip. It shattered because the myth depends on the audience believing the intent is aligned with the messaging. But wait, this is where PR mythology shows its most useful magic trick. When the scandal is about structure, PR tries to reframe it as wording. Hence the phrase that deserves its own museum exhibit: communication error. It's the modern apology that says everything and admits nothing. It implies the public simply misunderstood the intention, as if the confusion happened in the audience's brain rather than in the campaign's design. The myth shifts from "we sold goodness" to "we communicated goodness imperfectly," which is a neat way of preserving the moral self-image even while the commercial engine remains untouched. And then January 2026 hands the myth a fresh coat of paint: Acquitted. A Milan judge cleared Ferragni of fraud allegations tied to the campaign, and that verdict becomes the ultimate rebrand ingredient, because it lets the narrative jump from mistake to misunderstanding to vindication. The myth doesn't need to prove the charity was meaningful. It only needs to prove the scandal wasn't criminal. In the influencer economy, not illegal can be marketed as not wrong, and that's how reputations get rebuilt without addressing the deeper ethical question. Here's the part the acquittal can't disinfect. The structure still looks like a system for selling morality at retail. The legal question is narrow: fraud, criminal intent, whether prosecutors can prove a charge beyond the required threshold. But the public question is broader and uglier. Why was helping kids used as a marketing lever in the first place? And why did the campaign leave so many consumers believing their purchase was the donation? Italy's competition authority, AGCM, laid out the core mismatch that fueled the outrage. Reporting described how AGCM said consumers were misled into believing that buying the Ferragni-branded Pandoro would contribute to a donation to a children's hospital, when the €50,000 donation had already been made, and the sales proceeds largely benefited the companies involved. Even more corrosive, coverage said Ferragni-linked companies collected over €1 million from the initiative. That detail is the whole motive engine in one number, because once you introduce for charity into a commercial campaign, you're not just selling product, you're selling moral reassurance. And moral reassurance lets you charge more, sell faster, and dodge skepticism. It's not an accident, it's a proven tactic. Then the PR spell gets cast. Communication error. That phrase tries to reduce a structural incentive to a clerical mistake, as if the only issue was how something was worded, not how it was designed. It's the corporate equivalent of spilling oil into the ocean and calling it a hydration incident. It also quietly shifts responsibility. If it's a communication error, then the public is simply confused. The campaign remains noble, the intent remains pure, the brand remains good. The only villain is messaging, convenient, bloodless, unpunishable. But wait, because the consequences didn't originate in a courtroom. They originated in commerce. Multiple reports described how the scandal hit Ferragni's business relationships, with brands pausing or dropping partnerships and her image taking a reputational blow. That's the real accountability mechanism in influencer capitalism, not law, but brand risk. Companies don't sever ties because something is wrong. They sever ties because wrong becomes expensive. And once brands retreat, the influencer ecosystem scrambles to reboot the halo, because the halo is where the money is. Now add the January 2026 acquittal and watch how quickly legal outcome becomes moral absolution in the public narrative. Reuters reported a Milan judge acquitted Ferragni of fraud allegations tied to the Pandoro campaign. That clears a criminal charge. It does not automatically restore trust. But trust is exactly what the rebrand tries to extract from the verdict. The acquittal becomes a headline-friendly reset button, a way to announce a comeback without relitigating the ethical questions, because acquitted travels faster than the campaign structure still felt misleading, and in the attention economy, speed wins. Here's the detail people keep stepping over. Even if the charity donation existed, the consumer's belief about their purchase mattered. The outrage wasn't no one donated anything. The outrage was that the campaign allegedly made people think their buying act was the donation act. That's the psychological scam at the center of modern virtue marketing. You don't just sell goods, you sell the feeling that consumption is activism. If you can persuade someone that shopping is morality, you've turned ethics into a customer loyalty program. And once that becomes normal, everyone gets incentivized to play the same game. Brands chase the halo effect. Influencers chase the moral sheen. Consumers chase the painless hit of goodness. And when it collapses, the apology is designed not to clarify, but to preserve the option to do it again. That's what communication error really means. The system worked, but the optics failed. So the most uncomfortable question isn't whether Ferragni is innocent, it's whether this entire business model is built to blur the line between charity and marketing until the public can tell which one is the product. And if the law can only rule on narrow definitions of fraud, who rules on legitimacy? This story hits a wider nerve because it exposes how doing good has been productized in the influencer era. Traditional charity asks you to give, then you move on. Influencer charity marketing asks you to consume, then feel virtuous about it. That's a fundamentally different relationship with morality. Goodness becomes transactional, branded, and conveniently bundled into a purchase. The public isn't just buying cake, they're buying a narrative about themselves. I helped. I participated. I'm the kind of person who cares. And the moment that narrative gets questioned, people don't only feel misled, they feel embarrassed. Which is why the backlash can be so intense. It's not just anger at the influencer, it's anger at the realization that the consumer's goodness was monetized. The acquittal adds a modern twist that audiences are increasingly tired of: legal clarity without moral clarity. A court can decide whether a charge is proved. It can't decide whether a campaign was ethically honest. Reuters reported Ferragni was acquitted by a Milan judge of fraud allegations tied to the Pandoro campaign, and that gap between the criminal verdict and the public verdict is where the real cultural argument lives, because influencer capitalism thrives in that gray zone where something can be allowed while still feeling manipulative. And then there's the systemic ripple effect. Cases like this don't just damage one influencer, they corrode trust in cause marketing broadly. When consumers feel misled once, they start doubting every "buy this to help" claim, meaning genuine campaigns get treated with the same suspicion as cynical ones. Regulators step in, brands tighten messaging, and audiences harden into a default skepticism that punishes even real generosity. The scandal becomes a cultural lesson. In a market where morality is used as packaging, the public eventually starts assuming every act of kindness is just another flavor. In the end, the acquittal doesn't answer the question people actually care about. It answers a legal question, whether prosecutors could prove fraud in court. Reuters reported that a Milan judge acquitted Chiara Ferragni of fraud allegations tied to the Pandoro campaign. But the cultural question is nastier and harder. When for charity is used to sell a product, is the charity the purpose or the perfume? Because the scandal wasn't just a donation existed or didn't. It was the feeling that consumers were sold a shortcut to virtue. Buy the cake, feel good, become a better person by checkout. And when that shortcut collapses, the fix arrives as PR incense, communication error, as if the public merely misread the label, not the entire incentive structure. A verdict can clear a charge. It can't clear a brand of the suspicion that goodness was used as a pricing strategy. So here's the punchline that sticks. The most valuable ingredient in that Pandoro wasn't sugar. It was moral reassurance. And once you've tasted that kind of marketing, you start craving it. Until the day you realize you weren't buying kindness, you were buying the feeling of it. And the final question is simple. If kindness can be sold like a limited edition flavor, what happens to real charity when the market learns it's more profitable to sell the halo than the help?